So welcome everyone to this session. I'm Adnan Husain, a professor in the history department here at Queen's University and director of the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project, which aims to establish an interdisciplinary degree program in the future. In the field, and which sponsors and has sponsored for a number of years events like these for public education on and sharing of research in the study of the histories, cultures, languages, literatures, religious traditions, and politics of Muslim societies and peoples globally, including Muslim diasporas in the so-called West. And so for that reason, we often have events. And workshops on today's topic of Islamophobia, which of course concerns Muslims globally, but also in particular in societies like ours. And for that reason as well, we also annually mark the terrible anniversary of the Quebec City Mosque massacre, which took place on January 29th, 2017. And we remember its victims. We will be having an additional other event next week, a session with artist Akil Virani, who's particularly known and of interest in this context because for the 5th anniversary of the massacre, he prepared 7 portraits of the victims who were killed, murdered on that terrible evening in consultation with surviving family members. So that should be a very interesting conversation that's been organized by our colleague, Dr. Mehmet Karabella, and will be happening, as I said, next week on the 31st. And if you want to find out details, that's an in-person event, unlike today's. If you want to find further details, you can sign up on our mailing list through our web form on our website, queensu.ca/MSGP, or follow us on social media. You can see those links above me in my background, MSGPQU on basically all the platforms. And you'll find out more information about when that's happening, where it's happening, and so on. This evening, however, I first want to remind us that Queen's University sits upon the traditional unceded lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I happen currently to be speaking to you from London, UK, where I was reminded earlier today at a wonderful lecture by Dr. Hakim Adi about his recent acclaimed book, which I actually have, but you can't see because of the Zoom background. So I'll just read the title. African and Caribbean People in Britain, A History. I was reminded in his talk and in his book that human history is one of migration, of mixing of peoples, a process that some want to exclude from their official narratives, national histories. In this case, what I was referring to is the presence and the contributions of African peoples to Britain in Britain's history going back as far as 2,000 years ago, often unacknowledged. On the other hand, of course, we also have to confront the realities of settler colonialism as a particular violent historical process of dispossession and genocide of indigenous peoples, which is an ongoing process in North America or Turtle Island, around the world, from here to Palestine. So wherever we are, the kinds of history we acknowledge and are prepared to account and be accountable for are absolutely crucial to the kinds of society we want to build together. And today, we need to address a form of bigotry and racism that we need to confront and combat if we are to build a just and equitable society together. It's a form of bigotry and racism that has a long and persistent history here in Canada, in the United States, in Europe. And we want to address, in particular, the dramatic and recent rise as all recent compiled statistics show in Canada and the US, of incidents and expressions of Islamophobia, anti-Arab, and also anti-Palestinian violence, which has led to the brutal murder of a 6-year-old boy of Palestinian heritage, Wadia al-Fayoumi, and the wounding of his mother in the Chicago area, as well as the shooting of 3 Palestinian young men, college students, like perhaps many people in our audience, recently in Vermont. So to help us talk about Islamophobia's abiding, continuing forms and some of its new manifestations, to analyze and understand it, we have and are lucky to have a distinguished panel of scholars and experts who will each share some initial remarks of about 10 minutes or so in length, engage possibly in some discussion and response among themselves before then taking your questions, which you can put at any time in the Zoom chat or in the Facebook chat if you're watching on the Facebook live stream. So I'll just introduce our speakers, one of whom is still teaching a class and will be joining us shortly. We'll start in the order that I will now introduce our panelists. Dr. Ariel Salzmann is Associate Professor of Ottoman, Early Modern Mediterranean, and World History, with research and teaching interests in the history of exclusion, including Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, theories and histories of state formation, commodities, and market systems in the history of global capitalism. And we also have joining us, and she's, of course, teaching in the history department here at Queen's University. And we have joining us today also Dr. Dana Olwan, who is Associate Professor in Women's and Gender Studies at Syracuse University and is the author of a recent wonderful book. In fact, we have a Majlis podcast episode dedicated to it, a discussion with her, so do check it out. If you don't already know about it and subscribe to the Majlis. The title of that work is Gender Violence and the Transnational Politics of the Honor Crime. And her work traverses topics of gendered sexual violence, comparative settler colonialisms, and representations of Arab and Muslim women. And following them will be, as soon as he joins us, Dr. Hatem Bazian, who is co-founder of and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California. And in addition, he is a lecturer in both the Departments of Near Eastern Studies and the Department of Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He leads the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at UC Berkeley and is president of the International Islamophobia Studies and Research Association. His most recent book is Palestine, It is Something Colonial. So we look forward to him joining us. But without further ado, why don't I turn things over to Dr. Ariel Salzmann to begin remarks from the panel. Ariel, please proceed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all, and thank you for being here. And it's so lovely to see Professor Olwan with us as well. And we'll be joined later. Now, it's interesting that Professor Husain and I, Adnan and I, developed a course a few years ago on Islamophobia, which we taught. And unfortunately, we haven't taught again. It was 2 semesters on the eve of the Trump election. And as we noted in that course, Islamophobia is not a steady state. It changes. It has different attributes. For most of the history of Islamophobia, notably, it was really intertwined with anti-Semitism. It was almost inseparable from it. And I think the developments over the last 100 years, and even more so, every year, have shown this, in many ways, a widening between the two, and a reorientation, especially with the development of extreme Jewish nationalism, of an alliance with Christian people who are called Christian Zionists. And this, on the one hand, it would seem that things are, continuous. For example, the discussion about Amalek, and Adnan will know this, that Urban II is reputed to have said when he called the Crusaders to assemble, remember Amalek, and he sent the Crusaders out to slaughter every Muslim. So the Amaleks and the Muslims were synonymous. But of course, the Crusaders also saw the Jews as part of that evil group and slaughtered Jews all the way to the Holy Land. And then when they got to Jerusalem, killed everyone there, as Saul was commanded supposedly in the Old Testament to carry out against the Amalekites, to kill every single one of them, men, women, children, infants, and even their animals. This reference has now, of course, reappeared. It's always been there in discussions of extreme nationalists, within Israel, within Jewish communities, but also within Christian Zionists. And of course, it's reappeared in the wake of the October events, including in a speech that was referenced on the International Court of Justice by the South African jurists who brought the case of genocidal acts against the Israeli army for their actions, ongoing actions in Gaza. And it was referenced in terms of a speech given by Benjamin Netanyahu to rally the troops, quote unquote, in the spirit of Amalek, and to do what the Lord commanded. Now, the South Africans, when they presented this as part of the intentionality of genocidal acts and a genocide of what's going on in Gaza today, reference the actions of the soldiers themselves. But I would like to call attention to the fact that this reference has great resonance among many Christians in North America and in Europe. And so this dimension of Islamophobia today, I don't think can be separated from the ideas, eschatological ideas of Christian Zionists, and this notion that whatever Israel does, whatever violence ultra-nationalists do in the name of security in the Israeli state is supported 100% by large groups of Christians. In fact, their numbers are much greater than potential Jewish voters, or the assumption that Jewish voters are voting for any and all of Israeli actions. So I'd like to underscore with this Amalek reference the fact that Islamophobia has these other dimensions. They're clearly connected with what's happening in the Middle East, the ongoing struggle, the violence perpetrated by states against populations, but also by this echo chamber in North American politics. And it's that echo chamber and that support on one side that allows impunity for violence, that applauds this violence. And it's unprecedented in terms of the support, for example, from the US Congress, that the president, without even getting approval for arms transfers, can just push through hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons that are flowing into the Israeli army and being used against Palestinian civilians overwhelmingly in the Gaza Strip. So this Amalek reference, I think, adds a new dimension to, and I think expands this sort of group of supporters and solidarity behind basically a global Islamophobic program. It's also anti-Arab, but anti-Iranian, and has now complemented another set of geopolitical priorities that were aligned in the Cold War. And I think that's where more of where Biden comes from. But what he relies upon as well as the Republicans who basically get a huge block of voters out of evangelical Christians who are overwhelmingly in support of Israel's any actions that it carries out against the Palestinians. because they see it in there as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. It's enabling a type of violence that finds its echoes throughout North America and rising Islamophobia. Some of it, as Adnan pointed out, is specifically addressed to Palestinians in the context of this. But it represents a new, I think, frightening acceleration of general Islamophobia, insofar as there's no checks on it, and it's created this deafening silence, whether it's about what's happening in Gaza today, so that people are not able to speak, or it's not being solely considered that any commentary about what's happening to Palestinians today is considered Islamophobic. It's the fact that there's a larger group of lobbyists who are out there who seek to silence this whole discussion. And there's a new coalition that has been brought together over the years, to which Islamophobic speech, like that of Benjamin Netanyahu, or the soldiers who were videoed dancing in Gaza saying we're going to wipe out the Amalekites, that resonates with newer and newer populations that are just suffocating human thoughts and discussion about human rights, about foreign policy, including, of course, in Canada, which still continues to have very close relations with Israel and has not come out in support, although certain politicians have sort of given lip service to it in support of what's going on at the International Criminal Court. So as a scholar who's looked at this long-term evolution of Islamophobia from the Crusades, or even before the Crusades, onward, I would say we've reached a new, very frightening threshold. It's always been intimidating. It's always been licensed to violence against Muslims, against anyone who's identified. Of course, now it's licensed again against Arabs in general, Middle Easterners, but it represents a new kind of irrational fervor that this alliance between Christian Zionists and the ultra Zionist forces, nationalist forces within Israel, seek to realize in order to perpetuate and actually carry through on this final genocidal campaign against Gaza. So I think that's where my observations lie, that the two are inseparable, and that also that Islamophobia is changing in very, very frightening ways before our eyes, and at home and abroad.
Thanks so much, Ariel. I think it reminds me of what Huntington would call civilizational rallying, and that this situation has demarcated and revivified, and maybe, as you're pointing out, giving new manifestations for that kind of process that we saw during the global war on terrorism, but sort of reformulated more directly around this. Very interesting remarks. Hopefully we'll come back to some of this in our wider discussion, but let me now invite our second panelist, Dana, if you'd like to share some of your initial remarks and thoughts. And I see that we can also welcome Dr. Hatem Bazian, who we've introduced. He's at the panel, and he will follow Dana.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Adnan, or Dr. Husain, for having me here. And I really appreciate being in the company of...
Adnan's okay.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate being in the company of former professors, mentors, now colleagues and friends. So thank you to everyone who's here. It feels very special to be back as part of the community in Kingston, and to be doing this event through Queen's University as well. So I really appreciate the invite, and just want to thank also all the work that has gone into making this event possible, including the work of Gabriella, who is on this Zoom link. So I think I'm going to organize my comments around three main frames, and many of my comments actually echo and continue some of the really important grounding, historical grounding and foundational work that Dr. Husain and Dr. Salzmann have done here in this room, but also work that they have done beyond this room, whether in teaching and or writing, and as well addresses the important activist work and critical intellectual work that Dr. Bazian has done in California and elsewhere. So my comments today, as we know, this event is taking place to mark the National Day of Remembrance of the Quebec City Mosque attack and action against Islamophobia. This is a day that's been designated by the Canadian government to honor the survivors and victims of the assault on the mosque at the Islamic Center in Quebec in 2017. I think it's important that we remember that this attack actually took the lives of actual people, and it's important that we name those people. So in that effort and in that vein, and so those people who have been murdered are not disremembered, I want to name them today. So the attacks took the lives of Ibrahim Barri, who was 39 years old, Mamadou Tanu Barri, who was 42-year-old, Khalid Belqasimi, who was 60, Abdelkader Thabti, who was 44, Abdul Karim Hassan, who was 41, and Azzuddin Sufyan, who was 57-year-old. As you can see, the men who were targeted were people who had lives, they had families, they were members of communities. And the attack that took their lives not only aggrieved the communities, but actually intentionally meant to terrorize the Muslim community as a whole. And I think it's important that we understand that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism are actually attacks that are meant to terrorize us, to silence us, to break trust between our communities, and to make us hide and conceal our faith and our practice and the ways in which they intersect with our racialized identities and our politics. I also want to acknowledge that this panel, like my co-panelists have already stated, is taking place in the context of an ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, a genocide that has today claimed the lives of over 25,000 people, a genocide that is grounded and enacted through anti-Arab and anti-Muslim rhetoric, practice, and politics. And it's super important that we understand the connections between both. Palestine is not a peripheral issue to Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. It is, in fact, the site in which those two come together. So with that grounding, I think I want to make three central comments, and I think that I will be brief in making these comments in the hopes that we can actually discuss them in a broader framework and in conversation with you all. Ariel has already talked about kind of the long oeuvre of Islamophobia to understand the historical links and the grounding of Islamophobia in former historical moments and times, and I think that's super central. I think that if we want to borrow from Native Studies scholars, it's really important that we understand that anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia are actually not events, they're structures, they're systematic practices. They're based in actual racial formations. So it's really important that as we come to talk about Islamophobia, that we often scrutinize the terminology that we use and actually be very clear about what this terminology makes possible, how it's actually shifting, where and why it is shifting, and what it makes legible and what it makes ineligible or illegible in particular times. So what does it allow us to see and what does it not allow us to see? So this question of terminology is always central. And it's not a matter of coming to a consensus or agreement about which term is better, but it's actually about recognizing that what's at stake in our definition of Islamophobia and anti-Muslimness is actually the very foundation of our lives. It's our lives. That's what's at stake in it. So in addition to thinking about this language, this issue of language and the issue of terminology, I want to offer us two general ways by which we might want to think about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, and also the ways in which we can confront them. So the two central frames that I think are really, really important, they're ones that, again, have already been explained and explicated in the opening by Dr. Salzmann and Dr. Husain, which is the recognition of the intersectional or the intersections between Islamophobia and other forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, anti-Arabness, anti-Blackness, and anti-Asianness. So it's really important to remember that Islamophobia doesn't function in isolation of other forms of racism, but to understand the ways in which Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism actually intersect with other forms of racism and other structures of domination. With that, then, I think that if we want to understand Islamophobia, if we want to understand anti-Muslim manifestations today, and there are many, and we will talk about some of them, we also need to attend to the gendered, sexual, racial, and classed dimensions of Islamophobia. We must follow from the work of Black feminist scholars like Renshaw and others, and we should formulate a way of thinking about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism that's grounded in intersectionality, actually. Now, this doesn't mean that those categories need to appear or be understood from a North American framework, but we need to understand how the North American framework ends up enacting and or buttressing particular forms of Islamophobia and actually making them travel elsewhere. So there are links between the local and the global that have to be actually drawn. And this is why, in order to understand anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia today, we need to make the transnational links between manifestations of Islamophobia and anti-racism, both at home within our local context and also globally and abroad. So in order to do that kind of thinking, I just wanted to draw our attention to a few examples of things that are unfolding today, a few incidents of Islamophobia and racism. And I draw our attention to them not in an effort to isolate them, but in an effort actually to make us think about the connections between them. So in the United States today, the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, which is the Muslim civil rights groups for folks who do not know, who are based in Canada, just in the first month of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, said that it has received 2,171 complaints of Islamophobia and anti-Arab bias, which marked a 172% increase since the previous year. So I want to kind of note that as something that we might want to think about, like, what does it actually mean when we say that Islamophobia is on the rise? What does it mean to the lives of people, individuals? What does it mean to the organizations that are meant to protect us and support us? And how does this rise actually impact the work that they are trying to do? I want to also draw our attention to the shooting of Hisham Hawatani, Kenan Abdelhamid, and Tahsin Ahmad. These were three young Palestinian men who were shot and targeted because they were Palestinian, because they chose to wear kufiya, and because they dared to actually make Palestine visible in an environment in which Palestine is rendered invisible and or censored and or criminalized. These attacks cannot be understood as simply anti-Palestinian or anti-Muslim attacks, and that we need both frameworks to actually think about what happened in that instance. We can also look at the example of the murder of Wadi al-Fayoumi, who was stabbed 26 times by his family's landlord in Plainfield Township, Illinois. His 32-year-old mother, Hanan Shaheen, she suffered more than a dozen stab wounds in that very same attack. She was hospitalized after the attack. She was not able to actually be there at the time of the burial of her son. If you want to think about that event, of course, we have to ground that event in the rise of anti-Palestinian racism and the rise of anti-Muslim racism. But we have to also understand the consequence of this event on Palestinian and Arab and Muslim communities today. Noura Ariqat, yesterday, in a really beautiful article in The Nation, in which The Nation invited a number of Palestinians to reflect on their experiences as Palestinians in the US today, said that ever since 6-year-old Wadi al-Fayoumi was stabbed 26 times by his family's landlord, I have been acutely afraid for my daughter's safety and anxious that my public-facing work could cause her harm. I stay in costume and pretend everything is okay. So this is another point that we have to understand, that when Palestinians, when Muslims are attacked for their identity, the effect of it on our communities is fear and terror. Another thing that we might want to think about, and the ways in which we can utilize intersectional and transnational framework to attend to anti-Muslim and Islamophobic attacks that are taking place, is to look at the site of the campus and look at the site of the universities. At Stanford University, for example, a driver targeted an Arab Muslim student in a hit and run that authorities are still investigating and considering whether to call it a hate crime. At the American University, administrators have noted a rise in Islamophobia on campus. A note was left to students saying, "Go back where you came from and death to all Palestinians." Here we can see how Islamophobia intersects with xenophobia and American racism against international students or people who are assumed to be international. At Princeton, a staff member stole a student's phone and grabbed their hair at an off-campus protest and also compared all pro-Palestinian protesters to Hamas. These are also anti-Muslim and Islamophobic attacks. At George Washington University, students have reported that their hijabs have been ripped off at protests. These are not only Islamophobic and anti-Muslim attacks, they're also sexual and gendered attacks on Muslim women that have particular ramifications that make Muslim women fearful for their own lives and livelihoods, and also for the ways in which they dress and present themselves as Muslim women. So all these examples, what they point us to is that we cannot understand what is happening today. We cannot understand the rise of Islamophobia without attending to it in an intersectional and transnational way. And I want to kind of just end by saying that we do this work of grounding, and we do this work of historicizing and connecting and making the links visible because, as Sara Al-Hamoud, Palestinian feminist scholar Sara Al-Hamoud has said, our presence, our insistence on being and existing, and our insistence on belonging to each other as a people is a leap into the future. So our insistence on naming Islamophobia, on rendering apparent what it does to our lives, is an investment in our future. And I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Dana, for those remarks. A lot of important themes that hopefully we will have a chance to continue to discuss and take questions. And I just want to remind people that if they do have questions, they can put them at any time into the chat, either on the Zoom call or on the Facebook live streams chat. But let me turn things over for initial remarks from Dr. Hatem Bazian. Welcome.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. And it's a pleasure to be with you, Adnan. Sorry, Ariel, I have only been able to listen to the last part of your speech, and also thanks, Dana, for your comments. I just came from teaching and ran up here just to the office to be able to join. If I want to focus my comments, I want to speak of the 6 different zones of Islamophobia. And each zone functions and intersects with a variety of elements that are distinct. And this is for us to actually, when we engage Islamophobia, to be able both to do the specific and also to possibly discourage ourselves from reducing everything to a comparative, because sometimes they do not fit, even though that sometimes we could find elements that are present in one place or the other. The first zone that I actually look at and examine is the United States, English-speaking parts of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and parts of Western Europe that does not attempt to regulate modes of religious observance, food consumptions, halal, or clothing. So that zone, in essence, does not directly interfere in those elements, but it engages in hyper focus on, quote, terrorism and surveillance as the method of looking, examining, approaching the Muslim subject, and in this also creating a binary between the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. If we want to crystallize, the United States, even parts of Canada, tries to celebrate Muslims' inclusion by means of exclusion, because simultaneously this hyper-surveillance state, countering violent extremism, the PREVENT program, all those are operable, but they're not made visible through that process. So that literally you could wear the hijab. It's not problematized by the state or its elite apparatus, but is deployed in a specific way of a surveillance mechanism. The second zone for approaching Islamophobia is looking at France, Austria, Québec province, the Netherlands, Belgium. In this zone, I see that Islamophobia witnesses government efforts at defining Islam itself and controlling Muslim institutions, governing Muslim individuals and space. So that will be a heavy focus on articles of dress, a heavy focus on trying to limit, curtail, sometimes even completely prohibit halal food and halal choices, restrictions in school, so much so that literally you could say in France, there is a higher religious authority. I call it Mufti Macron, where he gives himself the prerogative not only to govern the state, but to tell Muslim what Islam is and it is not, and also creates, in essence, appoints the board that governs over these institutions. So France tends to be possibly some of the most pernicious representation, but it is definitely a modality that attempts to engage in Islamophobia, where the interference in the body and space of each Muslim and also their institutions. That doesn't mean they don't engage in surveillance. The surveillance state is present across many of these zones, but the outward manifestation of Islamophobia in this zone is very distinctive versus zone 1. The zone 3, which also people might be surprised, is Arab and Muslim majority states, where actually they engage is in a form of Islamophobia. The list of states includes many that belongs to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where Islamophobia takes the form that the only acceptable Islam is the Islam that is crafted by the state. And anyone that opposes, that critiques, that even utters any type of a statement is deemed to be outside the bounds, and literally the labels of terrorism is applied to them. Sometimes in some states, the label of Islamist is applied to them, the label of Muslim Brotherhood, increasingly also other groups that might not fit those likewise are entangled. So in here, the unique part is each state gets itself to say they represent Islam, and even go to the level to say Islam is the foundational, intellectual, the foundational for their law and legal system, but it is really very finely crafted to say Islam is what the state says it is, and anything that does not fall in it is actually seen to be outside the bounds, that is criminalized, demonized, and subject to arrest and so on. So that's a separate zone. The fourth zone is what I call the genocide zone. In this place, or this zone, includes states like China with the Uyghur, Bosnia, which experienced the Bosnian genocides. It's interesting how Europe never actually mentions the fact that there was a genocide that occurred right in the middle of Europe in the most recent past, in the early 1990s. When the war in the Ukraine took place, people say it didn't happen since World War II. So literally, the erasure of the Bosnian genocide of 300,000 people. India, in terms of what is taking place with Muslims in parts of India, Kashmir, Myanmar with the Rohingya, and Palestine. These are zones that are specific relative to genocide, where Islamophobia manifests itself in efforts to eliminate, in part or in the population, or engage in transfer out of Muslim populations from each of these countries and regions. Other elements of removing citizenship protection. So all of a sudden, and overnight, 5 million people become stateless in the zone. That's a different zone. It might not engage in trying to govern or regulate the particular practices of Muslim, but the Muslim himself, herself, their centers, their sites, their society in general is seen to be an impediment, and therefore it needs to be removed. So the genocide can take many forms: cultural, epistemological, sexual violence, linguistic, imprisonment, educational camps, and so on. So that's a different way to examine the genocide zone. The fifth zone is the social media zone. And the social media zone is really very unique because it's transnational, it's non-governmental, it's pervasive, and it's also ground zero for all conspiracy theories that often gets pushed in the social media on the web and slowly makes itself into the mainstream by some right-wing politician or a radio talk show or a TV talk show that drops materials that actually originate in the web completely discredited, but through repetition and engagement actually begins to be acceptable. The replacement theory, again, it's ground zero for it is in the web, and it makes its way into various political parties that are using a creeping Sharia in the United States, love jihad in India. All these are elements that actually are deployed in social media space by the Islamophobic industry, sometimes instrumentalizing the easy access and the fact that the entry level to social media is very cheap. Also, if you have a phone that is what you call smartphone, even though that all phones are dumb, but that's a side issue. So if you have that, you are able to engage and become a producer of Islamophobia in a transnational context. And we know the use of pods, the use of social media farms, where you get massive attacks directed at you, and you think that there are massive numbers of people that are coming, but in reality is being generated through algorithms, through social media, through these farms that actually send out massive messages. Those in academia, those in public space know that all of a sudden the next day you get 10,000 emails coming to you. You think there are 10,000 people. It's organized by the social media, the technology and apps that instrumentalize that method. The last zone is the zone what I call is the mainstream, the film industry, Hollywood, performing arts, and these are areas where Islamophobia is present. The cost of entry is high. It tends to actually reflect the primary Islamophobia of elites, whether it's the government in particular region. So the film, the performing arts tend to reflect that priority. And the area is in cultural production overall, a distinct zone from the social media. And here, the entry level is very expensive. The production is very sophisticated. The relationship that are struck for distribution, also access to some of the assets. For example, if you're going to do something favorable to the military, the assets to actually produce the film is given to you at a lower cost or no cost, versus if actually you're trying to produce something that critique. So this would be the area that Jack Shaheen in Real Bad Arabs, or even Edward Said critiquing in Orientalism and covering Islam, would fit into this and the critique of mainstream media. So these are my comments, and hopefully generate some questions and discussions further. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hatem. Dr. Bazian, for those remarks on the different zones. I'm just wondering if there's if anybody on the panel would like to pick up on any remarks or extend some of the remarks they made in light of what they've heard from other panelists before we open up. And I do want to remind members of the audience that you can pose questions by putting them in written form into the chat, either here in the Zoom call or on the Facebook live stream. So if you're watching on the Facebook live stream, we're monitoring that as well, and we will bring those and pose those questions. So please start doing that now if you haven't done so already. Well, I did have, we'll go, Ariel, did you want to jump in with something?
No, I just wanted to thank Donna for all her contribution and the specificity and really talking about the impact here and on real lives. But I would also like to address, because I think what Hatem is saying about this genocide zone, especially now, and what I was trying to talk about before you came, Hatem, which was about how this trope of Amalek is basically a dog whistle to bring the Christian right the Christian nationalists together with ultra-nationalists within the Israeli polity, and how powerful that has been in not only silencing, but allowing for a massive transfer of weaponry, which has gone without any critique or evaluation through the Congress. And Biden's able to do that. His proclivities are Cold War, and also, of course, Israel within that Cold War frame. But he relies on those Christian nationalists to step back and say, yes, another 100 million, another, shipments of bombs, replenish the stockpile in Israel. So that we have this genocide zone, we have perpetrators, we have accomplices, and they don't have to put on labels, I'm Islamophobic. They can wring their hands about what happened to a little boy, as Biden did, at the same time deny the statistics from Hamas and the Hamas, health department about the numbers of people, it's so obvious when you've destroyed 60% of the housing, you've displaced almost the entire population. That's what's being carried out is a genocidal act. So I just, linking those two comments, the specificity of Dana and Hatem's very nice categorization of different Islamophobic zones. Adnan?
Yeah.
I don't know whether
Yeah.
Hatem or Dana wants to respond to that.
I think I just want to say one thing, which I really appreciated in Ariel, your comments, the ways in which you were linking anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and anti-Muslimness together. I think that's super, super important. I was just reading this week about the case of the Newburgh Four. The last one of them was just released this week. James Cromite, who are four Black men who were actually entrapped by the FBI in 2009 and accused of being or planning to bomb synagogues. The case has been seen by courts as completely false. They have spent many years in prison. The men were targeted because they were Black, because they were poor, and because they were Muslim. And the way that the entrapment happened was through this assumption that because they were Muslim, they would be planning to bomb synagogues. And that's what ended up holding court in media and also legally. And then they tried them through Patriot Act and through the terrorism laws, anti-terrorism laws. So I just wanted to note that I think it's really important to understand that the reasons that these connections are not being made is because it is profitable and useful to actually pit these two communities together so that we don't see actually how white supremacy targets the lives of Jewish people and Muslim peoples in actually interconnected ways. So I appreciated the comment that you made earlier. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, yeah, go ahead, Hatem.
Yeah, if I may, the whole notion today that is pitting Jewish communities against Arab Muslim communities, Palestinians, we have to actually step back and at least recognize that we are all trying to fit into the Eurocentric millenarian worldview that is preparing or supposedly preparing the ground for the second coming of Jesus. And that also dates back to the Columbus. Actually, Columbus' mission going westward, his 4 trips, he says that to find enough gold and silver to create a new crusade, to fund a new crusade toward taking the Jerusalem and usher in the second coming. So in this sense, we have to both do a critique external, but also a critique internal, that we almost sometimes internalize these dynamics and begin to reduce the relationship of Jewish, Muslim, Arab, Palestinian relations to European relations or imposed relations upon us. So I remind people that, again, Zionism was born in Europe, not in the Muslim world. It was not born in Iraq, it was not born in Morocco, not in Egypt, not in Syria, not in Yemen, where you had Jewish communities that have co-participated in that broader notion of what we call Islamic civilization, Islamic millu. In only thinking of Zionist Palestinian relations or Zionist contemporary Arab-Muslim relations, we're actually only looking at European history being imposed externally based on this millenarian vision that continues to be operable, both within the United States and I would say also within the European lens that look at the region and its engagement with the region. And therefore, when Netanyahu uses the Amal Act, it is literally a notion to say that this is what we are about, this is what we are committed to in relations to the broader notion that existed within Western thought.
Yeah, okay. Well, we do have our first question from the audience, and it is from Lily. She identifies herself as Dorit's daughter. And a colleague of ours, and she says, "I'm on my MPP's youth council, so member of provincial parliament, so not the national but the provincial legislature. I was wondering if you have ideas for what the Ontario government can do to mitigate Islamophobia. I'm able to ask the MPP to ask questions of the Ontario government and put forward a motion or write a private member's bill. So we've got access to the legislature here, folks. What should we do?" I don't know if people have thoughts about what at the provincial governmental level we want to see in terms of action, against Islamophobia.
If I may jump immediately, one, I would ask for an immediate auditing of the security apparatus and what is their articulation and understanding of what the domestic threat is about. If my analysis is correct, the domestic threat is focused on the Muslim subject as the possible domestic violent threat, which leaves the assets and the resources of the security focused on the Muslim rather than on the white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and all those who are armed and sometimes are connected. So that would be one bill or a way to do an audit. Second, to audit the training programs that many of these individuals, in terms of content, material, cross-transnational, what you call linkages, are there and what is there. Third, most likely the Canadian government has a no-fly list, security list. And if the United States list is any indication, the 1.5 million, which had close to 98% correspondence with Muslim names, is to call on an immediate audit with an independent data analysis of the no-fly list and its correspondence to Muslim names and why such a list is used, one. And second, if that list is shared cross-national, meaning is it shared with the United States, because Canada is part of what we call the Five Eye network that observes. So that's on the infrastructure that is there. On the proactive, I would say to find legislation that would provide actual training in HR, in personnel, and so on, that goes beyond symbolic inclusion. Many of us in colleges, companies, they're all so happy to put a Muslim woman with a hijab, and that's their idea of inclusion. So we need to go beyond symbolic and do substantive inclusion that which requires training, and also that the training should be done by individuals and organizations that are connected to the community rather than getting what I call pilot experts parachuting in, and sometimes they're antagonistic to the Muslim community. So those would be things that are there. Lastly, I do think that you should ask for substantial funding to what you call critical educational institutions that are studying and engaging in Islamophobia, including possibly not your program or others, that you have a BA degree on studying and examining Islamophobia within an academic setting. So those will be my ideas of what you could actually immediately put into practice from a policy level.
Well, that's a lot of practical suggestions. I'm especially intrigued by the one about funding educational programs and
Oh,
degree
absolutely.
programs, which is a big issue and is in the remit of the provincial government. Whereas some of the security elements, like the no-fly list, would be at the federal government. But there is, of course, policing in the province and in the cities, and so a lot of those suggestions would be very useful. Okay,
If I may add, at the local level, specifically at the local level, many of the local jurisdictions have data sharing agreements. And therefore, you could intervene at the local level that local information gathered on Muslims should not be shared outside of the jurisdiction. And that's a local policing issue. And the data and the equipment should have regulation on it.
Well, fantastic. I mean, a great question and a lot of practical suggestions to follow up on. We have more questions coming in, so why don't we move to this one from Bahar Zakir. The question is, where does the shifting construction of white identity fit into the cleaving of anti-Semitism from Islamophobia and the joining of Zionism with white supremacy? I think a few people could take a shot at that. Ariel, do you want to start with that one at all?
Yeah, this is something I've been wrestling with because I think a colleague of mine who works on Caribbean migrants to the United States and Canada said that many of her respondents who were of African descent confessed that they didn't want to be Black twice. They didn't want to necessarily be associated with African Americans, and I think there's a growing in terms of I think there's a growing shift in the way that Jewish American and Euro-Jewish elites position themselves over the course of the 19th century, early 20th century, but especially after World War I. In order to minimize the sort of what they saw as a sort of contagion of being linked with Muslims, which had been the historic trajectory and which continues today, as Hatem pointed out, the replacement theory is a Muslim-Jewish conspiracy where Jews like Soros are the architects of bringing unwanted Muslim migrants into Europe and into the West. And was the chant in Virginia, the Jews will not replace this, is not that Jews were coming, it's that Jews were bringing immigrants in, namely Muslims. So I think that this is an ongoing trend. It's an ongoing feeds into white supremacy, that there is this link going way back between Jews and Muslims. And I think that American Jewish elites, especially, representing the largest Jewish communities outside of Israel, have tried to reposition themselves and tried to reformulate it. And so I think there's a very deliberate engineering of that. At the popular level, in this particular moment, and really since 2014, it's unprecedented Jewish young people who deny this, who see the relationship between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It's just amazing to see the organizations that have come out, and the organizations were attacked alongside Palestinians. And Islamophobic, the attack at Columbia University, right? With some kind of tear gas, that very, very strong tear gas that was used by the Israeli military, that was used against both Jewish students and other pro-Palestinian and Muslim students who were gathered.
It's called skunk water.
Skunk water. So what's interesting how, and I see this division now, that's happening all over in Europe and in Germany with Jewish groups who are recognize that white supremacy affects Jews as well as non-Jews, Blacks, indigenous people, and Palestinians who are pro-Palestinian, and they're being silenced now by the German government. They're being silenced on U.S. campuses and by their Congress people, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this, we're in this very strange period, but there has been, I think, a trajectory that Jewish elites have adopted to the extent that they gain the ear of and gain positions within the European establishment, at least before World War II. They actually rose very high up in French government and in German government, and then in the wake of World War II in the United States, as they were able to move into positions of power and distance themselves from the colonial projects, first of Europe, and of course then continuing with the United States, and became allies with that neocolonialism that was perpetrated by the United States and European powers. So I think it's this strange positioning. I think it also comes about with this notion of Judeo-Christianity, that somehow, like, where did this come from? It's very American, which, you know, it's not the Islamicate or the Abrahamic, the three traditions, you know. So and sort of distancing. No, we're not like those Semites, you know. So I don't know. Hatem might have some more ideas.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is that there's a whole total erasure of Jewish Muslim history in engagement with the subject of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and there's a constant attempt almost to break them apart, not knowing that both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, not with the name Islamophobia, but anti-Muslimness, literally dates back in the European discourses much, much earlier than only the 20th century. And we have a project where we take students and the program in Granada, Spain, right, to focus on the both the Inquisition and the expulsion. The Inquisition had rules that were in effect against Muslims and against Jews simultaneously. You could not observe kosher or halal. You could not dress with your religious attire. You could not have your religious texts. You needed to actually keep your windows and doors open to make sure that the inquisitor can observe that you're not keeping up any type of religious observances of Muslims or Jewishness. And then more importantly, to make sure that the institutions are completely transformed. So most of, if not all of the mosques and the synagogues completely transformed into religious Catholic institutions. And on back of it, also a regime of torture. So in Granada, downtown Granada, there is the Inquisition Museum, which is run by the small local Jewish community. And you have all of these instruments of torture that were used again by the Inquisition against Muslims and Jews, as well as women, Christian women who were called to be witches, sorcerers. 100,000 of them likewise were subject to the Inquisition. So creating an orthodoxy targeted all of the communities that were seen as part of the problematic. And then going further, post-1492 is that really we need to mine the history of Jewish-Muslim relations throughout the Mediterranean post-1492, so we don't end up making the mistake that we all of a sudden we discover Jewishness or Muslimness post-1948 creation of Israel and are forced to only think of what the United Nations or Great Britain, which always say, alhamdulillah, is no longer great, or the United States, that forces us to see their lens that has always been problematizing both communities in their engagement. So I think there's a lot of that needs to be done. Most people don't read Arabic or all Jewish sources in the Arab world. So it's very rare that you have somebody that actually will look at what the Iraqi Jews wrote as Iraqis in Iraq before their period, which they have a very, very strong presence in the literary tradition, writing books and engaging. the Jews in Morocco, Jews in Tunisia or Egypt, their engagement in trade, in partnership, all these is where actually we could re-navigate in order not to actually say that the only way for you to have a meaning is to become a Eurocentric or to adopt what you call the epistemology of whiteness, either directly or by, as often the case in the global south, by putting fair and lovely cream in order to whiten yourself outwardly to reflect the adoption of whiteness internally. So I think there's a lot of things that we have to do in order to shift the emphasis and to really expand the discussion in the contemporary period.
We do have another question. This may be of more local, I mean, in Canadian in that sense, but from Kyle DeCoste Johnston. Nice to have you with us, former student, I believe an MA student of Dr. Salzmann's, and
Hi, hello, Kyle.
and also took my Spirit of Bandung, Transnational Cultures of Resistance course. Kyle asks, can the panelists draw broader connections between the suite of practical measures we've been discussing against Islamophobic hate and historical contemporary framing of Islamophobia and the purview/mandate of the special representative on combating Islamophobia? So audience members who are not, or panelists who are not maybe as familiar with this office, this was created when the National Day of Remembrance and commemoration of the Québec City Mosque massacre and Day of Action against Islamophobia was created, pretty much, in the wake, you might say, of the attack upon the Muslim family in London, Ontario. There was mobilization and momentum, and the government was pressured to make this a National Day of Action and also unroll some other measures, which included appointing a special representative on combating Islamophobia. And the person appointed to that position was Amira Al-Ghawabi, a wonderful, public intellectual journalist in the Ottawa region. So the question really here is how might these be connected with at the national level, the mandate of the special representative on combating Islamophobia? While you're thinking about, what kinds of measures they could be taking through that office, I would just point out that office has been under attack. Okay, yeah. So it wasn't just that, okay, we've got this wonderful, resource for us. It has been under attack. Its legitimacy has been, constantly under, very serious criticism and pressure. And she herself, who is a very, I've met her, I've been on panels with her, a very committed, but a genuinely very nice diplomatic person. It was a very, good choice. Has personally been under a whole lot of pressure and attack for the merest of, indications of solidarity with Muslims and Muslim causes. And this does lead me to a question I wanted to ask. So maybe we can talk about this, and then the wider question that I had for the panel is that Dana talked about a lot of the particular incidents that she mentioned and examples that she gave were things that derived from either the campus environment, where there has been a lot of politicization, ongoing knowledge discussion and activism on campus, or at protests, where Muslims are not only visible in public space, but they're articulating a political standpoint. And the thing that seems to connect, I'm wondering, with the rise in experiences of Islamophobia has a lot to do with the increasing visibleness of Muslims who are making demands in the public sphere and taking on a political position. And that seems to be particularly problematic and challenging, and is polarizing people and, who object to the idea of Muslims exercising citizenship and political rights. in these societies. And so I wonder if that's maybe also something to think about in terms of the zones of Islamophobia and its manifestation, is how forms of political expression heighten the kind of virulence of Islamophobia's attacks on Muslims. But first, any thoughts about how we can materialize this with the office of the special representative on combating Islamophobia?
I just want to add to that. Isn't there's also Sarah Jama, who's under attack for comments. She's a member of the provincial parliament, and they're trying to oust her for comments she's made. So I don't know if people know more about that. I know the Jewish Faculty Network is aligned with Arab advocates of Sarah Jama. So, maybe someone in the audience knows more about what's going on. They signed letter blame. They want for her ouster from she's federal NDP.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, we can see that, people who are representing Muslim issues in the public sphere are
They're voicing
obvious
solidarity with
targets.
Gaza. She was
Yeah.
censured for that. So let's see what the new representative has to say about that. But I know
Yeah.
that there's a lawsuit now that's Jewish Faculty Network and Arab advocates are taking up for her.
Well, and just as a coda to that, and the remarks that I was making about the problem of politicization is I think we're also going to see, as we're entering a U.S. electoral cycle, a real ramping up of anti-Muslim sentiment, liberal Islamophobia. I think I'm predicting, I've already seen it starting. I'm predicting we will see virulent liberal Islamophobia because Muslims are politically making critiques of the current Biden administration's policies and handling of and refusal to place any serious, restrictions upon, Israel in its, genocidal attack on Gaza, and are threatening political action of not voting for the Biden regime. And so I expect we will see a lot of vote shaming, blaming, and Islamophobic attacks on Muslims for representing a dissident political position, and they will be blamed, for Biden's loss of the upcoming election, which was probably, might have happened anyway, but this will be another aspect of scapegoating of Muslims and of kind of exiling them from the public sphere, and as illegitimate, for taking on a political position. So anyway, these are some thoughts I had about the way politics tends to feed Islamophobia in the polemical kind of political discourses and atmosphere and environment that we've been witnessing, that this dynamic only sharpens that kind of dynamic.
And then is it possible for me to comment?
Yeah, please. Yes.
It's not specific. I can't speak to the specifics of the office that was mentioned in Canada. I stopped living in Canada more than 10 years ago. But I do want to say that I think that we do have to be aware of like the limits of state kind of funded projects of recognition in the form of those kinds of offices. Of course, they are useful. Of course, they are important, but they're often constrained by, in the Canadian state, by the liberal multicultural state logic. So it's really important that we also understand how being a state office actually also constrains the kind of work that people can and will do. This is not to underestimate or overlook the attacks, the personal and very racist and very racialized and gendered attacks on the folks who occupy these offices, or to undermine the work that they do. It's just to say that I think it is important for us to understand that the state is not where we're going to look for fighting anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia, and that fighting Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism is a multi-pronged, long strategy that requires community building. It requires that we make connections. It requires that we refuse binaries. It requires that we make the connections that were just made here in this conversation today. Even the simple connection that actually anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are connected and have been historically for a very long time. And it's also in insisting on making those connections visible and viable. So one example that we can give to see how far white supremacy is going to actually break those kinds of connections, again, I'll go back to campus politics, but for example, when Columbia decided to disband or ban SJP, it also disbanded JVP, which is Jewish Voices for Peace. That is not an accident. That is not a coincidence. That's actually to break the very possible alliances that people are building between confronting anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim racism and the refusal, the insistence, in fact, on refusing to conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. So white supremacists are hard at work to make those connections not only invisible, but actually to render them illegitimate, not possible. So I think that, you know, it's important that we insist on them, but also that we build them, because those kinds of possibilities, those kinds of connections are not inherent. They have to be actually fostered. They have to be created. And so the only way forward, the only path forward is actually community building. It's to actually make the connections visible, but also enact those kinds of connections. So, and I wanted to say that also in relation to the really excellent question that we got from Bahar, I believe, regarding the shifting meanings of whiteness. Yeah, so thank you for those questions. I also want to do a shout out for Lily, who I haven't seen in like 10 years. Lots of love. Thank you for being here.
Excellent. Yes. Great remarks. We do have just about 10 minutes left for this session. So if you do have questions and you've been thinking about putting it into the chat, now is the time to do it. If you've been hanging on to it, don't hang on longer onto them. Let's get them out there. But we do have one question here from Casey Johnson. The Biden administration has already shown tentative disregard for the ICJ decision, which I think people are expecting tomorrow. Wouldn't that bring a crisis of legitimacy both in the United States and the international courts? Could that invite more Islamophobic attacks? I'm not sure exactly in which direction there, but what do you think about a crisis of legitimacy in the United States and international courts if the U.S. rejects, decisions, assuming we know what the decision is? But yeah.
I'm a little bit what you call on the realist line. The United States have always had complete disregard to the international standards. Recalling all the way back when the United States was found guilty of mining the harbors during the war in Latin America and Nicaragua. The United States basically completely disregarded the decision and did not pay attention to it. And I don't want to open the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, which is running, throughout the Geneva Convention, completely violating every tenet of international law. However, on the other element, I do feel that Israel has crossed a point of no return, in the sense that it no longer can stand publicly on the international stage and put its case forward of why it continues to be a viable member of the international state body, while continuing to deny the basic rights of the Palestinians, where people are actually following minute by minute the unfolding genocide in front of them. It still can count on the United States, but even the United States, almost 40% plus of the Democratic base believes that it is actually a genocide. 1/3 of the American public believes it's only a genocide. So in this sense, the ability of a state to function as normative within the international body as a state, I think it has already reached an irreversible positionality vis-a-vis the international system. And in here, I'm not referring to state politics, but everyday person across the globe. And I think that's where the crisis is present for Israel, and it might lead to some consequences for the United States. But I do think the United States still has the political leverage to project its superpower. Not that I believe that's what it should, but the United States still has that ability to project it. And there are a large number of states that are within the sphere of influence with the United States. So that's how I read whichever way the ICJ go. And then we also have the ICC, the International Criminal Court cases that have been forwarded. So this points that the fear wall that possibly prohibited or militated against people going publicly against Israel is already have collapsed, and there is no way that it can be reconstituted, no matter what Israel's spokespeople, political, diplomats. I think they have reached a level of diminished return on everything. If they stay silent, actually, it's much better for them collectively. But they insist actually on speaking, and they don't know when to stop, and that's the problem. They don't know when to stop, and that for me is the critical issue that Israel is facing right now. They still operate as if they operated in the 1970s. They don't know that the world has transformed, that the world is witness the first time in history that we have a genocide that has been streamed live for people minute by minute. And no matter of public relations can actually undo that. And that's what they don't realize, that they don't find the consequences of the moment.
I think there is, going back to what Adnan was saying, I think there is a sort of, there's going to be a blame game against everyone, including, small blocks in Michigan, but everyone who criticized Biden's, full-scale, full-throated support of Israel through this, even when he's wringing his hands, as the Israelis say, crying and shooting, or him frying and rearming Israel at the same time. But I think there will be huge consequences in terms of whatever is constituted as liberalism, or the liberal side of the Democratic Party. When you have people like Michelle Goldberg, who just wants to, I don't want to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about abortion, and I'm going to talk about reproductive rights, and I expect you to be my allies now. So I think this is the real crisis that is forming within the Democratic Party, and will likely lead to, unfortunately, Biden's defeat. We don't know if he doesn't step down as LBJ did, because of his conduct of the Vietnam War, as some people hope he will. But I think that's one thing. And as Hatem says, Israel has totally the United States has totally disregarded international law. It went into Iraq, it forced the Iraqi government to say, we will never prosecute one of your soldiers. So they presume they have complete immunity anywhere in the world. The U.S. was the last to sign the Genocide Convention, very late, because they didn't want to be held accountable for this, the treatment of Africans, the millions of Africans who were enslaved, and in terms of genocide of indigenous populations. So they held back for years. So, as far as the Genocide Convention, and Israel has already said they're not going to abide by anything that the convention, including just the provisional terms that the South African government has asked, which is a ceasefire. So I think, if anything, it goes back to what Donna said. I think we need alliances. We need to realize them and really restructure institutions within North America, and have this sort of broad-based education about white supremacy, about racism, that embraces and helps people understand the marginalization process and how it happened historically and how it continues today, and faces so many people, genders, etc. So.
Well, I promised that we would only do an hour and a half, and we have still yet to thank all of you for coming, for joining, for participating and creating a really good conversation. I think it's clear that among the things that needs to be done is more education on these issues. That's a key part of how civil society, how people in the community, this knowledge has to move from just the academic kinds of research and studies, which need to take place, but it needs to be shared and disseminated in fora like this by having experts and scholars actually speak to the public like we've done today. And so I want to thank them for taking the time and trouble, to thank Dr. Ariel Salzmann, Dr. Dana Olwan, and Dr. Hatem Bazian for giving us these really incisive analyses and remarks and interpretations of phenomenon that we're dealing with, as well as a lot of also great practical suggestions about how we can go about redressing Islamophobia in our institutions, in our workplaces, in our governments, and the whole range. So again, I want to thank everyone and wish you all a good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakat. And also look forward for an event next week that will be more of a kind of commemoration of the January 29th anniversary in the Quebec City Mosque massacre, with artist Akil Virani, who has worked to memorializing the victims and processing grief of Islamophobic violence through his art. So look for that by contacting us, getting on our mailing list. You can sign up on our web form, queensu.ca/MSGP, and follow us on social media at MSGPQU, basically on all the platforms. So again, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Adnan.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Ariel.
Hatem.
Thank
Good
you,
to see
Gabriella.
everybody.
Thank the audience for showing up and engaging.
And if you had friends, and tell your friends about this important conversation, they can watch this on video on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page. So do share it with others. Get the word out there. Thanks again, everyone.